They ask me to start from the beginning. I tell them there is no beginning, not really. There's just the world before Grimm got its hooks in deep enough to matter, and then there's everything after. And everything after is what I'm here to talk about. My name is Smith. That's what they called me, what she called me, and that's all the name I needed. I was a field operative attached to a resistance cell operating out of the northern transit corridors, back when the corridors still had civilian traffic moving through them. By the time this story properly starts, the civilians were long gone. Just us, and the Grimm soldiers, and the things Grimm had engineered to walk point for them. I'll get to the things in a moment. Give me time. The GRIMM Corporation had been consolidating control of planetary operations for the better part of a decade before most people understood what was happening. They came in the way of all the great swallowing forces in human history, quietly, through contracts and compliance agreements, through infrastructure deals and security partnerships. They ran the shipping lanes first, then the orbital relays, then the power grids and the water treatment facilities and the agricultural distribution networks. By the time any government with real teeth tried to push back, Grimm already controlled too much of the machinery that kept people alive to be meaningfully opposed. You don't make war on the hand that feeds you. You just take whatever it gives you and try not to choke on it. I was not good at not choking. I'd been a logistics coordinator for what had once been a Northern Regional Transit Authority, a civilian position, a desk position, the kind of job that involved spreadsheets and quarterly compliance reports and arguments about maintenance scheduling. Nothing about it suggested any particular aptitude for what came after. But I knew the transit corridors the way you know the layout of your own house, not from maps, but from the accumulated muscle memory of 10,000 small navigational decisions. I knew which junctions had redundant access routes. I knew which maintenance passages connected to which freight arteries. I knew where the seams were in the infrastructure, because I'd spent years being responsible for some of them. When Grimm absorbed the Transit Authority, absorbed is the word they used, always absorbed, never seized or occupied or took, I was given a choice that was not really a choice. I could stay on and administer the corridor network under Grimm's operational protocols, which were efficient and precise, and left no room for anything the corporation hadn't authorized. Or I could leave. Grimm didn't threaten people who chose to leave. They simply ensured that the options available to people who had chosen to leave were limited in specific ways. The food allocation system, the housing registry, the medical access protocols. None of these were explicitly denied to people who'd made the wrong choice. They simply became less accessible through mechanisms that were themselves never explicitly connected to any choice the person had made. Plausible deniability applied to the daily operations of human survival. I left anyway. I've never been good at the kind of patience that compliance requires. It took me 4 months to find the cell. Or rather, 4 months before the cell decided it had seen enough of my movements through the transit junctions to approach me. They'd been watching. They were always watching. In those early days, any new variable in their operational environment was a potential threat, and potential threats were assessed before they were engaged. The person who approached me was Bait, which I didn't know was her name at the time. She walked up to me at a relay junction that I'd been using as an informal navigation point and said, with no preamble at all, "You used the Weller Junction last Thursday. That's not an efficient route from the 3rd tier to the freight staging area." I said, "No, it isn't." She looked at me. "Why did you use it?" "Because I knew it was being watched, and I wanted to see who was doing the watching." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Come with me." That was how I met Red. The REDD program was never formally acknowledged. I don't say that to sound dramatic, it's just a fact. There are no records I'm aware of that place us in the buildings we were in, doing the things we did. We were designated as a Rapid Enforcement and Direct Defense Unit, and whoever came up with that acronym was trying very hard. What we actually were was a small group of people who had decided that compliance was a form of dying, and who preferred to do their dying on their own terms. We operated in cells. We moved constantly. We struck what we could strike, and we ran when we had to run, which was most of the time. I was not the most important person in our cell. I want to be clear about that. I was good with a weapon, and I knew the transit corridors well enough to navigate them blind, and I was useful in a fight because I had the particular kind of stubbornness that kept me functional after I'd been hurt. But I was support. I was logistics. I was the man who held the line while other people made the decisions that mattered. The person who made the decisions that mattered was Red. I'll tell you about her the way I'd tell anyone who asked, carefully, because she would have hated to be described. She had no patience for sentiment, and even less for ceremony. She was compact and absolutely precise in every movement, the way very dangerous things tend to be. She'd come up through a military training program that GRIMM had absorbed, and then quietly shut down when they realized they'd created people they couldn't reliably control. She was one of maybe 8 graduates who got out before the program was dissolved. The others, the ones who weren't killed in the dissolution itself, scattered and went to ground. Red came looking for a fight. The first time I saw her operate in the field, she took down a 4-man GRIMM patrol in a transit maintenance corridor using 3 rounds and a fire suppression valve that she'd identified as a tactical asset during our approach walkthrough. Not identified in the moment, identified during the walkthrough, filed away, retrieved at the exact instant it was needed. That was how she operated. She was always thinking 3 steps ahead of the current problem, but she never let the 3-step thinking make her inattentive to the immediate step. She was present, and she was planning, and she held both of those simultaneously in a way that I've never seen in anyone else before or since. She led the cell because she was the best at it, not because she wanted to. She would have been happier operating alone, I think. She had the capability for it, the self-sufficiency and the tolerance for solitude that solo operations require. But she understood that what they were trying to do was too large for one person to accomplish, and she was not someone who let preference override necessity. That discipline, that willingness to set aside what she wanted in favor of what the situation required, was the core of what made her dangerous to GRIMM. They understood fighters. They understood people who were angry and skilled and motivated by grievance. What they didn't understand was someone who was all of those things and also completely rational about it. Anger doesn't plan. Red planned. We'd been operating together for 11 months when J.W. GRIMM authorized the Fort Eagle operation. Fort Eagle was what we called it. The official GRIMM designation was Regional Processing Hub 7, which told you everything you needed to know about how they thought about human beings. It sat at the intersection of 3 major transit arteries in what had once been a functioning mid-sized city, and it served as the logistical hub for GRIMM's expansion into the northern sectors. Everything moved through Fort Eagle: supplies, personnel, and the canisters. The canisters especially. I should explain the canisters. GRIMM's monster core, and I use that word without irony, because that is exactly what they were, didn't reproduce in any biological sense that I could recognize. They were engineered, grown in facilities that we'd never located, matured in controlled environments that we could only infer from the results, and then shipped to deployment zones in sealed pressurized canisters that were temperature regulated and fed intravenously until the moment of release. When a canister was opened, what came out of it was already hungry, already oriented toward any warm-blooded presence in the environment, already moving with a kind of fluid, purposeful menace that made your back brain go very quiet and your legs want to make independent decisions about direction. The things GRIMM deployed were not like anything evolution had produced on its own. They were built for function in the way a weapon is built for function, every element of their biology oriented toward a single end. They were fast. They were strong in ways that seemed to violate what flesh and bone ought to be capable of. They felt nothing that I could identify as pain, or if they felt it, they did not respond to it the way pain is supposed to make a living thing respond. You could put rounds into one, and it would keep moving as though the rounds were a minor irritation. You could put rounds into one until it stopped moving, and while you were doing that it would be very focused on reaching you. There were different types. GRIMM had been iterating on the designs for years, and by the time we were operating against them, they had a reasonably diverse arsenal. The ones I saw most often I'll describe as best I can, though I'll tell you up front that language does not do the job justice. There were the fast ones, pale, elongated, with too many joints in the limbs and a way of moving that looked like water running uphill. They were deployed for pursuit. If GRIMM needed something chased down in open terrain, they opened a canister of the fast ones and stood clear. There were the Nosferatu. That's what Weller started calling them, and the name stuck. They were larger, slower, built for sustained engagement rather than speed. They had a way of absorbing punishment that suggested GRIMM had done something unusual to their skeletal structure, reinforced it somehow, redistributed the load-bearing so that the usual points of catastrophic failure simply weren't where you expected them to be. You shot a Nosferatu in the chest, and the round went in and it noted that and kept moving. You had to know where to shoot. There were things Bait, that was our intelligence operative, Amanda Elizabeth, who everyone called Bait, had designated as sorceresses in her reports, though she'd never have admitted to anyone that she found the name satisfying. They were the ones that disturbed me most, if I'm being honest. Not because they were the most physically threatening, they weren't necessarily, but because of the way they coordinated. The other monster types operated on what appeared to be individual instinct, a kind of aggressive proximity response that made them dangerous but predictable. The sorceresses were different. They communicated, or did something that functioned like communication, and when one of them was operating in an area, the behavior of every other monster type in that area changed. They became coordinated. They started operating as a unit. GRIMM had figured out how to give their monster core a command layer, and they'd built it out of something that looked, if you squinted, uncomfortably like intelligence. I did not like looking at them. I tried not to in the field. J.W. GRIMM was the man who ran the northern sector operations for the corporation. His sister, Elizabeth GRIMM, handled corporate compliance and what they called community integration, which meant she ran the programs that kept civilian populations from organizing effectively. Between them, they controlled everything north of the 42nd parallel. J.W. handled the hard edge of the operation, the soldiers and the monsters and the enforcement. Elizabeth handled the soft edge, which in some ways was worse. A hard edge you can see. A soft edge gets in everywhere. The intelligence on Fort Eagle came from a source inside GRIMM's logistics chain that I'll call Monk, because that's what he was, a quiet man, an ascetic man who had worked for the corporation for 6 years before something shifted in him. I don't know what shifted it. I didn't ask. People arrive at resistance in their own time and for their own reasons, and the ones who arrive by choice tend to be more reliable than the ones who arrive by compulsion. Monk was reliable. He gave us the canister shipment schedule, the soldier rotation, the structural layout of Fort Eagle, and the location of J.W. GRIMM's command post within the facility. He gave us all of that, and then he disappeared, which I choose to believe means he got out clean rather than the alternative. There were 3 days between receiving Monk's intelligence and the operation. 3 days is not a long time to plan something of this complexity, and Red spent most of them working through contingencies, the what-ifs that branch off a primary plan and need to be accounted for without letting the accounting overwhelm the plan itself. I spent those days on the physical preparation, verifying the route, confirming the timing windows, reading everything Bait had compiled on the Fort Eagle facility and on the people who ran it. That was when I read the field pathology report. It had come in 6 weeks earlier, from an operative in the southeastern sector, who had gotten access to a Nosferatu unit that GRIMM's maintenance teams had recovered from an engagement, damaged but largely intact, which was unusual. Most Nosferatu that went down in the field were destroyed by GRIMM's own cleanup teams afterward, both for operational security and because a damaged Nosferatu was not reliably less dangerous than a functional one. This one had been recovered because it had gone down in a location that GRIMM needed to clear quickly, and the recovery team hadn't followed protocol. Someone in the southeastern cell had gotten 3 hours with it. The report was technical in places that I'm not qualified to evaluate, and practical in the places that mattered. The Nosferatu's skeletal structure was reinforced at every major joint with a composite material that the pathologist could not fully identify, but described as functionally similar to the way aircraft designers reinforce stress points, load-bearing geometry, rather than simple material strength. The upshot was that standard rounds at standard targeting points, center mass, vital organs as best as you could identify them, were not effective. The material didn't stop the rounds, but it distributed the energy in ways that prevented the catastrophic structural failure you needed to put one down. The weak point was the shoulder joint, both of them, at a specific angle, roughly 40 degrees above horizontal, directed toward the clavicular region where the composite reinforcement had its lowest overlap. A round could disrupt the mechanical function of the arm without needing to penetrate deep enough to do systemic biological damage. The Nosferatu would fall. It would not immediately get up, because getting up from a prone position without functional arm motion is difficult, and the Nosferatu's biology, for all its engineered resilience, was still organized around a body plan that needed its limbs. I read that report 3 times, and then I put it in the part of my memory that I kept for things I might need in a hurry. The plan was Red's. It was, as her plans tended to be, more aggressive than anyone else would have designed it, and more viable than anyone else would have thought, and it depended on a form of timing that I spent 3 days memorizing until it was as natural to me as my own heartbeat. We were going in during the window between the incoming canister shipment and the release authorization, a period of roughly 40 minutes when Fort Eagle would be holding live canisters in the intake bay, and the security complement would be split between monitoring the shipment and conducting the standard shift change. It was the only window. If we missed it, we missed our shot at J.W. GRIMM, and J.W. GRIMM was the primary target. Taking J.W. GRIMM off the board would not end the corporation's northern operations. We were not under any illusions about that. Elizabeth GRIMM would step in, or someone would be rotated up from the corporate structure to fill the gap. But J.W. GRIMM was the architect of the monster deployment strategy. He was the one who had figured out the sorceress coordination layer. He was the one who had built the doctrine that was currently pushing the remaining resistance cells out of the northern transit corridors and into positions that were going to become untenable within 6 months. Removing him would cost GRIMM something real: time, institutional knowledge, momentum. And time was what we were fighting for. Not victory. Not yet. Time. Our cell going in was 5 people. Red and me. Bait, running communications and intelligence from a position outside the perimeter. Snow, who was our best shooter at distance and who would be covering our exit. And Carter, who was 3 weeks out from a leg wound that had healed enough to be functional but not enough to be comfortable, and who had told Red she was going in regardless of what anyone said about it, and whom Red had looked at for a long moment and then simply nodded at. Carter's full name was Jennifer Carter. She was 26 years old. She was the best breacher we had. We went in through the Western Service entrance at the transit junction, a connection point between Fort Eagle's intake systems and the old city freight infrastructure, which GRIMM had absorbed but not fully integrated, which meant there were seams in the security architecture if you knew where to push. Carter found the seam. She always found the seam. Inside Fort Eagle at 3:40, and the first thing I noticed was the sound. The intake bay was loud in a way that had nothing to do with machinery. The canisters were stacked 3 high along the western wall, maybe 40 of them, and they were humming. Not a mechanical hum, something organic, something that resonated at a frequency just below conscious awareness and made the small hairs on your arms stand up without you quite knowing why. The things inside were aware they'd arrived somewhere. They were doing whatever the equivalent of being ready is, for something that has no thoughts as we understand thoughts, but that is engineered for a single, consuming purpose. Red looked at the canisters. She looked at them for exactly the time it took to make a decision, and then she moved on. I followed her. The GRIMM soldiers were not incompetent. I want to say that clearly, because there's a certain comfort in imagining your opponents as fools, and I've learned that comfort is dangerous. The soldiers at Fort Eagle were trained, equipped, and motivated by either genuine loyalty to the corporation, or the more reliable motivation of knowing what happened to people who showed insufficient loyalty to the corporation. They had overlapping patrol routes. They had communication protocols. They had the sorceresses, deployed in pairs at the facility's choke points, serving as both alarm systems and enforcers. We encountered the first sorceress at the junction between the intake bay and the command corridor. It was standing with the stillness that the sorceresses had, not the stillness of something resting, but the stillness of something listening, or something that functions like listening, reading vibration and heat, and the subtle pressure differentials that moving bodies create. It turned toward us before we'd made a sound. Red shot it twice. Center mass, which I already told you was not where you shot a Nosferatu, but sorceresses were different. They were built for coordination rather than resilience, and twice center mass put this one down. The problem was the sound. Suppressors reduce sound, they don't eliminate it, and a sorceress going down makes its own noise. A frequency shift that the other sorceress in range would read the same way you read a scream. We had perhaps 90 seconds before the second one oriented toward us, and the soldiers in the corridor started asking questions. Carter was already moving. She went through the service door at the corridor junction with the particular fluid urgency that very precise people move with when they're operating at the edge of their own capability. Red followed. I was last through, and I pulled the door shut behind me, and then we were in the maintenance passage that ran parallel to the command corridor, and Red was counting under her breath. The command post was at the end of the passage, behind a security door that Carter had the codes for Monk's intelligence, 3 days old, which meant there was a reasonable chance the codes had been rotated. Carter's expression when she punched them in told me she was aware of this. Her expression when the door opened told me she'd prepared for both outcomes and was relieved about which one had arrived. J.W. Grimm was not alone. The command post had been built inside what had once been the facility manager's office, reinforced walls, redundant communications, 3 displays running continuous feeds from the security system. J.W. Grimm was at the central display. He was a thin man, taller than I'd expected from the intelligence photographs, with the kind of stillness that people develop when they've spent a long time giving orders and not being questioned about them. He turned when we came through the door with the particular unhurried quality of someone who is surprised, but refuses to let surprise govern them. Beside him was Weller, Simon Weller, his personal security chief, who I knew from Bates' intelligence files as a man who had been doing this kind of work for 15 years, and who had survived it by making himself very difficult to surprise and very efficient in his response to surprises. Weller had a weapon in his hand before we were fully through the door. The next 3 seconds were not something I'll describe in detail. They happened, and at the end of them, Weller was on the floor and Carter had taken a round through the shoulder that spun her into the wall, and Red had J.W. Grimm by the collar and her weapon at the base of his skull. I went to Carter. She was not going to bleed out. The round had gone through the muscle rather than into anything vital, but she was hurt and she was furious and she was trying to get back to her feet. I held her still. Sometimes the most useful thing I did was hold people still. Carter, stay. I'm fine. You're fine when I say you're fine. She stopped arguing, which told me she was hurting more than she was willing to admit. Red had said nothing to J.W. Grimm. She was looking at the security displays. I looked at them too, and what I saw made my chest tighten in a way I'd learned to interpret as important information about my immediate survival prospects. The second sorceress had oriented toward the command post. It was in the corridor outside, and it was standing the way sorceresses stand when they're reading an environment, and behind it there were 6 GRIMM soldiers moving up with weapons ready. And on the intake bay feed, there were 2 soldiers at the canister array, and one of them had his hand on a release lever. J.W. Grimm said, very calmly, "You have perhaps 3 minutes before this facility becomes somewhere you cannot survive. I would suggest using them to negotiate." Red said, "You're going to tell me everything you know about the Eastern deployment schedule." "I'm not going to tell you anything. You'll tell me, or I'll take the displays instead of you." He paused at that. It was a short pause, but I'd been watching faces in hard rooms for long enough to read it. He hadn't expected her to know about the displays. "Bait," Red said, speaking to the comms unit at her collar. "Are you recording?" Bait's voice came back crisp and without inflection. "Everything." The displays were running continuous feeds from the security architecture, yes. But they were also running something else. An administrative feed that Bait had identified from the outside, an automated reporting system that uploaded operational summaries to GRIMM's central command on a scheduled cycle. What the displays held, in aggregate, was a compressed summary of every deployment decision J.W. Grimm had made in the northern sector for the preceding 90 days. Force dispositions. Monster allocation. The locations of the remaining resistance cells that Grimm had identified and was preparing to move against. We didn't need J.W. Grimm to tell us anything. We needed 30 more seconds on the displays. I understood what Red was doing. She was keeping him talking. "The displays upload to your central archive on a 13-minute cycle," she said. "The last upload was 11 minutes ago. We wait 2 more minutes and we walk out with everything in this room." J.W. Grimm's face did something complicated. He was a man who made his plans carefully and executed them with precision, and he was looking at a situation where someone had made a more careful plan than he had and executed it with greater precision. And he was doing the mental arithmetic of someone who understands they have been outmaneuvered, but is still looking for the exit vector. "The sorceress in the corridor will have the soldiers through that door in 90 seconds, he said. "Then you have 90 seconds to decide whether this goes easier for you." He was quiet, the seconds moved. In my earpiece, Snow's voice. Calm, the way Snow's voice was always calm. The way certain people get calm when the situation becomes serious enough that being calm is the only rational response to it. "We have a problem outside," Snow said. "Vehicle convoy, 4 units pulling into the eastern approach. Looks like a response team." Red's jaw tightened. The arithmetic had just changed. Response teams meant a rapid reaction force, which meant Grimm had been alerted by something other than us. The sorceress frequency shift, probably, transmitted to the monitoring center before we'd made it to the command post. They'd had enough time to scramble a response team. That was faster than the intelligence had suggested they could move. "How long?" Red said. 6 minutes to the facility, maybe 5. 2 minutes on the display cycle. 5 minutes to the response team. 90 seconds to the soldiers in the corridor. Carter with a hole in her shoulder. Me doing math that wasn't adding up to anything comfortable. "Bait," Red said. "Working on it." A pause. Then, "I can access the intake bay release from outside. If I trigger the emergency vent sequence, it'll cycle the bay air through the eastern vents. Won't affect the canisters, but it'll force the soldiers in the corridor to fall back. Grimm's protocol on a vent event is to clear all personnel from within 50 meters of the intake bay." "What does that do to the sorceress?" "A beat, I don't know." Red looked at me. I looked back at her. We had both read the same intelligence reports on sorceress behavior during environmental disruptions, and what those reports said was that the disruption tended to interrupt the coordination layer, not permanently, not fully, but enough to create a window. The sorceresses were extremely sensitive to environmental frequency shifts. A major air circulation event in the intake bay would create exactly that kind of shift. It would confuse the one in the corridor. For how long, we didn't know. Long enough to move through, possibly. Do it, Red said. The sound that followed was not dramatic. It was a low, mechanical cycling, fans engaging, pressure equalization, the groan of an old building's ventilation system being asked to do something it wasn't designed to do quickly. But through the security display, we watched the soldiers in the corridor stop moving. We watched them look at each other. And we watched the sorceress in the corridor go still in a different way than it had been still before. The stillness of something that has lost its frequency reference and is trying to reacquire it. J.W. Grimm watched all of this. He was very still himself. 45 seconds, Bates said. Then the display cycle completes. J.W. Grimm said, "You can't get out." "We can get out," Red said. "The question is whether you're with us when we do." "You're going to take me." "We're going to try." He looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had built his operation on control, on knowing where everything was and what everything was doing and what would happen next. And here was a woman who had walked through his control architecture with a plan that had accounted for things he hadn't thought to account for, and she was telling him with absolute calm that she was going to try, not promising success, not performing confidence she didn't have. Just stating intent and acknowledging uncertainty, the way honest people do when they're operating at the edge of what's possible. I watched something in his face settle. "The response team will have the eastern approach locked within 4 minutes," he said. "The western service route is your only viable exit. The ventilation event will have the intake bay soldiers relocating to the secondary muster point, which means the western corridor will be clear for approximately 3 minutes. Red looked at him. "I'm not negotiating," J.W. Grimm said. "I'm telling you what I know. There's a difference." "Why?" He took a breath. "Because my sister runs the compliance programs. If Grimm's operational intelligence falls into the hands of a resistance cell, the response will be to collapse the civilian support networks as a security measure. Thousands of people lose food and water access while Grimm rebuilds the architecture. Elizabeth will do it without hesitation." He paused. "I won't tell you the data is worth those lives, but I'll tell you the math is worse than you think." It was a complicated thing he'd said. It might have been true. It might have been a play. In the moment we didn't have the luxury of determining which, and Red knew that, and she made the decision she made. "Move," she said. I got Carter upright. She hissed through her teeth, but she was mobile. She was going to be mobile as long as she needed to be, which was a thing I'd learned about Carter, that she had an extraordinary ability to defer the consequences of injury to a future moment when the immediate situation had been resolved. She put her weight on the good side and moved. J.W. Grimm moved ahead of Red, which was exactly where she wanted him. The corridor was clear. The intake bay was loud with the ventilation cycle, and the sorceress was still in its disrupted stillness, head moving in small arcs like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. We went past it fast, and it tracked us, and it made a sound I hadn't heard a sorceress make before, something low and almost mournful, like a frequency being broadcast into a room where nobody was receiving. And then we were past it, and through the western passage, and Carter was breathing hard through her nose, and we were moving. Snow had eyes on the western approach. She said nothing, which meant it was clear, which was the only way Snow communicated clear. She would have said something if it wasn't. The service door. Carter went through first because she was the breacher, and that was her door regardless of what was happening to her shoulder. Then J.W. Grimm. Then me. Red last, and she paused in the doorway for a moment. I didn't see what she did in that moment. I only know that she paused, and then she was through, and the door was shut. Outside was cold. The city around Fort Eagle was dark in the particular way of places where the power is managed rather than reliable, blocks of dark and blocks of light, The light concentrated where GRIMM wanted its people visible and comfortable and aware of the corporation's provision. We were in a dark block. Snow was 60 meters out on an elevated position that I won't describe more precisely than that. "Response team is at the eastern approach," she said. "They're staged, but they haven't entered." "Why not?" Red said. "Comms issue. Someone on the inside is reporting the ventilation event as a contamination alert. They're waiting for clearance." I looked at Red. She was looking at J.W. Grimm. "He said I didn't do that." "I know," she said. "Bait." Bait's voice was satisfied in the particular way that people who are very good at things sound satisfied when those things go as planned. The intake bay's air filtration system is rated for biological contamination. When I triggered the vent sequence, I also tripped the contamination detection algorithm. It's an automated response. Grimm's protocol is mandatory hold until the hazmat team clears the site. A pause. "It'll buy you maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes was enough. 20 minutes was more than enough. We moved through the dark blocks of the old city, with J.W. Grimm walking between Red and me, and Carter managing her shoulder, with the focused silence of someone spending every unit of available concentration on forward motion. Snow materialized from an elevated position and fell in on our flank without a word, because Snow rarely used words when her presence served the same purpose. The exfil point was 7 blocks out. We made 5 of them before it went wrong. The thing that stepped out of the alley entrance was a Nosferatu. I don't know how it got there, whether it had been deployed as an advance element before the response team staged, or whether it had been operating autonomously in the area, and we'd simply crossed its proximity threshold. It doesn't matter how it got there. It was there, and it was looking at us with the flat, total attention that the Nosferatu brought to anything warm-blooded in their immediate environment. Nosferatu were built for sustained engagement. They were built to absorb. They moved deliberately, without the fast one's liquid urgency, because they didn't need speed, they had endurance. You couldn't hurt them enough to make them stop, not with standard rounds, not at the places your instincts told you to aim. Snow raised her weapon. "Shoulders," I said, "both shoulders high." Snow didn't question it. Snow never questioned the target information. She just placed the rounds. 2 shots, and the Nosferatu's arms dropped, not because the shots had destroyed the arms, but because the joint structure at the shoulder was a load-bearing point in a way that Grimm's engineers hadn't fully protected, and 2 precisely placed rounds at that specific angle disrupted the mechanical function, without necessarily penetrating deep enough to do biological damage. The Nosferatu fell forward. It was trying to get its arms under it, and it couldn't. It was not dead. It would not stay down indefinitely, but it was down long enough. Carter was staring at it. She'd never seen one stop that fast. "Bait briefed me," I said, 3 weeks ago. Intelligence from a field pathologist who'd done analysis on a recovered unit. Carter said, "Why didn't you tell us?" "I just told you." We moved around the Nosferatu and kept going. Behind us, it was making sounds of considerable displeasure. Ahead of us, the exfil point was 2 blocks. J.W. Grimm said nothing for the rest of the walk. He was a man doing arithmetic, which I respected. When you are in a situation that has moved beyond your control, arithmetic is the most useful thing you can do. The exfil point was a maintenance depot that had been converted to a transit staging area during the early years of Grimm's infrastructure consolidation, and then deprioritized when the transit patterns shifted. It sat in a blind spot in the security architecture, not because we'd created the blind spot, but because Grimm's expansion had been fast enough that their security mapping hadn't kept pace with their territorial coverage. They controlled more than they could effectively watch. This was true of every expanding power in the history of expanding powers, and it was the seam that resistance cells lived in. Bait was there. She was compact and precise in the way that intelligence operatives become when they have spent years fitting themselves into small spaces and remaining very quiet. She looked at Carter's shoulder and then at me, and I shook my head. Manageable, meaning not now, meaning we had time. She looked at J.W. Grimm. He looked back at her with the steady regard of a man who has decided to be cooperative and is waiting for the cooperation to begin. The display data transferred, Bates said. I have everything from the operational archive, force dispositions, deployment schedules, the identification files on the resistance cells Grimm has located. She paused. There are 11 cells in the northern sector they have positive locations on. 7 of them were scheduled for suppression operations in the next 30 days. Red was looking at J.W. Grimm. He said, 12 cells. You missed one, the one in the Weller Transit Junction, Bates' location. He said it without particular emphasis, as though he was nodding a factual inaccuracy rather than acknowledging a threat. Grimm knows where you are, has known for 3 weeks. The operational decision not to move on it was mine. I wanted to see whether the cell would lead me to the upstream elements of the resistance network. The room was very quiet. Bates said, and did we? No, he looked at Red. You don't have upstream elements. You're not connected to a larger structure. You're operating independently because you've concluded that larger structures are vulnerable to infiltration, and you're right. He paused. My sister is more thorough than I am. When she takes over the northern sector, and she will, within 72 hours of whatever Grimm decides to do with me, she won't leave operational decisions like that on the table. She'll move on every identified cell simultaneously. She'll move on yours. Red said, you're telling me this because you want something. I'm telling you this because the math I mentioned earlier is still relevant. If Elizabeth Grimm is running the northern sector and she collapses the civilian support networks as a security measure, a great many people suffer. That's not a threat, it's how she operates. He met Red's eyes. She would not make the operational decisions I made. She would not leave cells in place to observe. She would not hesitate. You want us to let you go. I want you to understand the full accounting before you make a decision. Red was quiet for a long time. The rest of us were quiet too, because this was not a moment for input. This was a moment for the person who had carried this operation from conception to execution, to make a judgment call about something that had moved beyond the parameters of the original plan. She said, you'll provide us with the location and schedule of Grimm's mobile monitoring unit, the one that does the cell identification sweeps. He nodded once. And the algorithmic pattern it uses to identify active resistance cells from ambient data. Another nod. And you'll tell your sister that the suppression operations in the northern sector are being delayed because of intelligence gaps that need to be addressed before deployment. You'll give us 60 days. He looked at her for a long moment. She'll suspect. She'll suspect, Red agreed. But she won't know, and you're good at maintaining uncertainty. J.W. Grimm almost smiled. It was a very small thing and it didn't stay long, but it was there. You've done your research. I've done my work, Red said. There's a difference. The agreement, if that's what it was not documented. There was nothing to sign and no ceremony to perform, and no reason to believe that a man who had built his operation on control would feel bound by a conversation in a maintenance depot. Red understood this. She was not naive about what she was releasing into the world. She was making a calculation about what the alternatives produced, and she decided this one produced the least harm on balance, and she was going to live with it either way. J.W. Grimm walked out of the depot alone. We watched him go on the security feed from Bates' portable unit. He walked 7 blocks to a Grimm monitoring station and went inside, and 4 minutes later the response team at Fort Eagle stood down from its staged position and began withdrawing. Whatever he'd told them, they believed it. Carter said, "That might be the most dangerous thing I've ever watched anyone do." "Which part?" I said. "Letting him walk." I thought about it. She didn't let him walk, she made a trade. There's a difference. Carter looked at her shoulder. The bleeding had slowed. She was going to need a proper medical kit in about a week, neither of which we had in excess supply. "Does it usually work?" she said. "I don't know," I said honestly. "We haven't tried it before." In the weeks that followed, the data from the Fort Eagle displays was moved through the resistance network with as much speed as we could manage. 7 cells that had been marked for suppression were relocated before the 30-day window GRIMM had been planning to act in. New locations, new protocols. The mobile monitoring unit schedule was disrupted 3 times by operations that knew exactly where it was going to be and could therefore plan around it. There was a cost. There's always a cost, and the accounting in those weeks was heavier than I'll go into here. 2 operatives in a cell we'd warned, people who'd gotten the relocation intelligence from us and had moved on it, were caught in transit by an Elizabeth GRIMM response team that was faster than it should have been. We don't know if there was a leak or if Elizabeth simply had better pattern recognition than we'd credited. It doesn't change the outcome. We carried that. You carry what happens under your operation. That's not a rule anyone writes down. It's just what it means to be responsible for decisions. Elizabeth GRIMM took over the northern sector on the 4th day after the Fort Eagle operation, exactly as her brother had predicted. She was, as advertised, more thorough. The civilian support networks were not collapsed. J.W. GRIMM had apparently made the delay credible enough that Elizabeth inherited a situation that didn't immediately justify that kind of response. But she brought a different quality of attention to the sector. Sharper, faster, less interested in observation, and more interested in result. She also modified the monster core deployment doctrine. Not dramatically. She didn't have enough time to redesign something J.W. GRIMM had spent years building, but she made 2 changes that we felt within the first week. She stopped holding the sorceresses at fixed choke points and started rotating them through variable positions on irregular schedules. Fixed positions could be mapped and accounted for. Variable positions with irregular schedules could not without continuous surveillance that we didn't have the resources to maintain. The second change was that she started deploying the fast ones in advance of soldier movements, clearing corridors before her teams entered them. We'd been using the corridor transit system as our primary movement route because GRIMM soldiers moved in predictable patterns. With the fast ones running ahead of the patrols, the corridors became unpredictable in a different way. We adapted. That's the only word for it. We adapted, and it cost us time and energy and a margin of safety that we'd gotten accustomed to having, and we adapted anyway because not adapting wasn't an option. Snow found a new exfil pattern. Bate reconstructed the cell communications architecture to account for the monitoring unit's adjusted schedule. Carter's shoulder healed, mostly. She found a different way to carry her kit that distributed the weight so the repaired muscle didn't catch. Red spent 3 weeks developing a counter-doctrine for the fast ones. She watched every piece of footage we had of them in motion, and she read everything Bate had compiled on their behavioral parameters, and she talked to 2 other cell leaders who'd had engagements with them, and she came up with something that was not elegant. She said so herself, and Red had high standards for elegance, but that worked. The fast ones operated on proximity response and heat signature. They were built for pursuit, which meant they were optimized for forward motion and not particularly capable of rapid lateral change of direction. You didn't outrun them. You broke their pursuit geometry. You moved in ways that forced them to change direction repeatedly, and on the 3rd or 4th forced change of direction, the pursuit instinct would partially reset and they'd have to reacquire. In that window, 2, maybe 3 seconds, you put distance between yourself and them, or you got to a position where you could address them effectively. It was the kind of thing that sounds simple and is not simple at all, and it required practice that we ran in the transit junction dead zones until it was reflexive. Carter ran it on her healing shoulder and didn't complain about it, which was a form of complaining that I'd learned to recognize and respect. And Red did what she always did, which was look at the situation that existed rather than the one she'd planned for, and figure out what the situation required. The 60 days that J.W. Grimm had agreed to buy us were not 60 days of safety. They were 60 days of slightly less pressure, which is not the same thing. Elizabeth Grimm was still running her sector. The monitoring sweeps were still happening. The canister shipments were still moving through Fort Eagle. A new facility commander had been rotated in within the first week. A man named Chappell who was, by all accounts, more rigorous about security protocol than J.W. Grimm had been. Less given to leaving operational variables in place for observation purposes. More inclined to act on incomplete intelligence rather than wait for certainty. We had to assume the clock on those 60 days was running fast. I am here giving this debrief because we're into the third week of a new operational phase, and the commanding elements of this coalition want a first-person account of the Fort Eagle operation before we proceed. I understand why. Fort Eagle was the first operation in the northern sector that produced significant actionable intelligence without triggering a full Grimm reprisal, and the people planning what comes next want to understand how that happened and whether it can be replicated. My honest answer is, partly. The specific combination of circumstances at Fort Eagle Monk's intelligence, the canister shipment window, the display cycle timing, J.W. Grimm's presence and the calculation he made about his sister's methods, that specific combination does not exist anywhere else. Operations are not replicated. They're designed, case by case, to fit the specific terrain and the specific moment and the specific people involved. What can be replicated is the method, the careful preparation, the patience with intelligence gathering, the willingness to account for contingencies without letting the contingency planning paralyze the primary plan, the commitment to making the best decision available with the information at hand, and then doing the work to make that decision the right one. And the other thing, the thing that I've been circling around this whole debrief, because it's the hardest one to articulate and the most important. Grimm built an extraordinary apparatus. They built it over 10 years with the resources of a planetary-scale corporation and the strategic patience of people who understood that the goal was control, and that control was best achieved gradually, through mechanisms that people didn't recognize as control until it was already complete. They built their monster core with rigor and imagination and genuine scientific ingenuity. They built their soldier training programs with efficiency and effectiveness. They built their compliance and community integration programs, Elizabeth Grimm's domain, with a sophistication that I genuinely respect, in the way that you respect a thing that is good at what it does even when what it does is harm you. What they didn't build for is what has been defeating them, slowly, in operations like Fort Eagle, and in the dozen operations that the data from Fort Eagle made possible. They didn't build for the kind of person who will spend 3 weeks studying footage of their monsters to find the behavioral vulnerability in the pursuit geometry. They didn't build for the kind of person who reads a field pathology report about a recovered Nosferatu and puts the shoulder joint information in the part of their memory they keep for things they might need in a hurry. They didn't build for the kind of organization that keeps operating after 2 of its members are caught in transit, that carries the cost of that and keeps working. They built for compliance, and they built very well for compliance. The systems they created, the food allocation, the housing registry, the medical access protocols, were genuinely effective at producing compliance in the vast majority of people who encountered them. Most people, when the cost of resistance becomes high enough and the prospect of success becomes uncertain enough, choose compliance. This is not a moral failing. It is a rational response to a difficult situation. Grimm understood human beings well enough to build systems that made compliance the rational choice. What they missed, what they keep missing, is that rational isn't the only mode humans operate in. There is a thing that happens in people, in some people, in enough people, where the rational accounting stops being the governing factor, where the answer to, is this worth the cost, becomes something that cannot be computed from the available variables, because the available variables don't include the part of you that simply refuses. Not refuses because of a calculation. Not refuses because of an ideology or a belief system or a political position. Just refuses, at some level that is below argument, because the alternative is a version of yourself that you cannot inhabit. Red refused. Carter refused, with a hole in her shoulder and 3 weeks on a healing leg running evasion drills in a transit junction dead zone. Snow refused in her quiet way, with her precise shots and her calm voice on the comms. Bait refused, running intelligence in a cell that GRIMM had a positive location on for 3 weeks while she rebuilt the communications architecture around them. I refused. We were not special. I want to be very clear about that. We were people who had found the place in ourselves where refusing was the only option that fit, and we had organized that refusal as efficiently as we could and kept working. GRIMM is going to keep finding that. They're going to keep finding it in the northern transit corridors and in the cells that the Fort Eagle intelligence allowed us to preserve, and in the cells we haven't found yet and that Elizabeth GRIMM hasn't found yet, and in the people who are going to arrive at their own refusal in their own time over the next months and years. They cannot account for it in their planning because it does not behave like a variable that can be managed. It behaves like a constant. They built a very good machine for making compliance the rational choice. They built it among a species for whom rational has never been the only choice. I was there for the debrief that followed the Fort Eagle operation. The one I'm giving you now is the one I've given before, stripped of the operational details that are still sensitive, and I've thought a lot about what it means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean we won. We hadn't won. GRIMM still controlled the transit lanes and the orbital relays and the power infrastructure and the supply chains. Elizabeth GRIMM was running the northern sector with a quality of focus that was going to find us eventually. The math was still bad. But the math was less bad than it had been. 11 cells were still operational that would have been suppressed. 7 of them moved to locations GRIMM didn't know about. The operational archive from Fort Eagle was in the hands of people who knew how to use it. And somewhere in the GRIMM Northern Sector Command, J.W. GRIMM was making decisions that, for the time being, introduced a 60-day margin of uncertainty into Elizabeth GRIMM's suppression timeline. 60 days is a long time when you're living in the margins. The thing I keep coming back to, when I think about the Fort Eagle operation, is the Nosferatu in the alley. That moment when Snow raised her weapon and I gave her the target information and it worked, not because we'd had a bigger weapon or more people or some advantage that the situation didn't naturally contain, but because Bate had gotten a field pathology report 3 weeks earlier and I'd read it carefully and remembered it. A piece of information, patiently acquired and carefully retained, applied at the moment it was needed. GRIMM built their monster core to be strong. They built them to be fast. They built them to be resilient and coordinated and immune to the standard forms of human violence. They built them to be everything that a purely physical threat needs to be, and they were very good at it. What they didn't build for was a species that reads pathology reports about their monsters and remembers the weak points and waits for the right moment to use them. What they didn't account for was the particular human habit of making a study of the things that are trying to kill you. They built their soldier corps to obey and enforce. They built their administrative structure to control and suppress. They built their compliance programs to make resistance seem futile enough that the effort of mounting it wasn't worth the cost. What they missed, what they kept missing, what Elizabeth GRIMM was going to keep missing even with her sharper attention and her faster response times, was that futility is not the same thing as impossibility, and that the distance between those two things is exactly the space that a certain kind of person lives in. Not a special kind of person, not a particularly gifted or heroic kind. Just the kind that looks at the situation that exists and does the work that the situation requires and doesn't stop doing it, because the accounting comes out unfavorable. Red was that kind of person. Carter was. Bate was. Snow was. I was. There were others. More than Grimm's intelligence suggested. More than Elizabeth Grimm was going to find in her sweeps, because finding them required understanding them, and understanding them required understanding why people keep fighting after they've already lost, which was a question Grimm had never asked because it was a question they couldn't conceive of needing to ask. They were going to need to ask it. We were going to keep making sure of that. The last thing I'll tell you is this. The night after Fort Eagle, I sat with Red in the maintenance depot while Bate and Snow were running the data extraction, and Carter was sleeping with her shoulder wrapped, and her weapon within reach the way soldiers sleep. It was the quiet hour, the one that comes after the urgency has passed, and before the next urgency begins, and Red was looking at nothing in particular with the focused inwardness that meant she was doing her own accounting. I said, "Did you think it would work?" She was quiet for a moment. The operation or the decision? Either, both. She thought about it seriously the way she thought about everything. The operation was within parameters. The decision, she paused. No, I wasn't sure the decision would work. I'm still not sure. But you made it. You make the best decision you can with what you know, and then you do the work to make it the right one. She looked at me. That's all there is. I sat with that for a while. Outside, the city that Grimm controlled moved through its managed rhythms, the lights cycling on their authorized patterns, the transit lanes running their authorized loads, the monitoring units making their rounds through sectors they believed they understood. They didn't understand them, they hadn't yet. I intend to keep it that way for as long as I can.